called me the other night and she says to me, I want to start a blog.
Yeah.
So she's an occupational therapist. She
Yeah.
works, 5, 6 days a week. She's very busy. She works in a hospital. She doesn't have much time, right?
Right.
So she wants to do this to kind of share her thoughts on millennial trends. That was
Mhm.
her idea. So I said, okay, that's a great idea. She kind of just wants to use it as a hobby, to see if
Right.
there are other people who are feeling what she's feeling and share her opinions on things.
Mhm.
So I said, okay. She said, I don't even know where to start. I don't even know, like, what do you do?
Right.
So I started to explain to her some of the things that I think we should talk about
Mhm.
right now, like registering a URL, CMSs, the whole
Right.
line.
Okay.
So what I think we should do is kind of pretend we're talking to my sister who really
Uh-huh.
knows nothing, because there are so many people out there. We talk to people who are kind of in this world, even if they're not.
Right.
I mean, they're familiar with even if they're not using what we're using, they're
Right.
familiar with things.
Well, I wouldn't even question that, right? Because I think there's a lot, registering a URL, it's interesting because I would say even high level people.
Register a lot of URLs.
Well, yeah, I register probably more than I should. It's a bad habit, but I think even people at high levels in big companies don't even actually understand how the process of registering a URL, right? I mean, or the way DNS works or things like that. So yeah, I mean, I think it's good to start there. That's probably the first point. Like, how do you register a URL? It's not that complicated, right? You choose who you're going to register it with. So there's tons of companies out there. There's GoDaddy, which is probably one of the biggest. There's Vario. I mean, we could just start naming them off, but you're registering a domain, and that basically gets added to, an international database
I
of.
have a question. Let's back up, because here's what my sister would say to that, because I know she'll say, well, what's the difference? Like,
It
what's the better
You know
one?
what? The benefit of who you're registering it with is who you want to host it with. Why is that? So if you're going to host with GoDaddy, you want to register with GoDaddy. If you're going to host with Vario, you're going to want to, say, for instance, register with Vario. Now, why is that? It doesn't matter at the end of the day, but it's one less place you got to track down your information. So if you're registered, what happens, and let's just use GoDaddy as the example. I register with GoDaddy. Now my domain is registered with GoDaddy. My information is in there, so I'm going to know when it expires. Versus if I had that domain registered with a different company, even though I'm hosting with GoDaddy, because I could register my domain and host somewhere else. So when you do it with one company, you have more. It's in one place. It's like anything else. It's like if you have two different email addresses, you're checking two different places, right? So it's the concept of that. If everything's in one place, it makes it a little bit easier to control. Plus, you'll also get, if you need tech support, it's going to be easier to say, hey, GoDaddy tech support, here's my domain in here. Like, for instance, if you have a DNS issue, they're not going to have to go, okay, go to the other thing, get your name server pointed at this, right? It gets
So
really.
what's a DNS? There's Amber's next question.
So basically the DNS is basically the number that the website correlates to. It's not like, I wouldn't go crazy. And the name server is basically where that's housed, and it shows it where to point. So there's a whole bunch of pointers in the background. That's why for someone who's starting, it's good to, my point is, all these details, it's good to do it in one place. So pick where you're going to register your domain and use them as the host, especially when you're starting. So once you register the domain.
Well, before that, actually, because she said she did a lot of research about registering a URL.
Right.
And she said, so I read all of these, all these tips and what not to do. She's like, but what do you suggest? And I kind of told her, stay away from, I explained to her kind of the weight that a URL plays in your website ranking. And so don't be trendy, I told her. I mean, I understand she's, she's looking to be trendy, and maybe that's fine for her. Maybe she doesn't care if anybody comes there, and that's cool. If you don't care, do what you want, really.
Yeah, I mean, it's all relative, right? It depends on the way you want to build it, and it depends on your tact. So let's just go, say you wanted to name, your site something trendy, like you wanted to name it purplestonelion.com.
I
And you
think
were
it
going to.
was sunrise, something with a sunrise in it. But
But say Sunrise Millennials, right? That's your URL. I don't care. It doesn't matter. right? What you call it, because you said it was millennial trends, right?
Right.
sunrisemillennialtrends.com, right? Someone go register that right now. So say, for instance, that's what you went with, okay, the word millennials is in there, which is good, but here's the thing. It really depends, and here's why. Is it good for the name to be in there if you're doing like a lot of keyword things? And obviously a lot of site searches are based on keywords and things people are putting in. So yes and no. Here's why. Yes, it's great, right? If you have trends that millennials do and you're asking a straight out question, right? Because that's the search, like trends for millennials, right? What are the top trends for millennials? Like say that was your URL. People may put that question directly into a search engine. So that would be a huge benefit. Now, if you could think about like all those sites out there, like Glassdoor, what does that have to do with employment?
Exactly.
eBay.
That was the point she raised, right?
Right. What does eBay have to do with auctions? Now, don't get me wrong, eBay is a nice short URL. Glassdoor is sort of random. I mean, but you could pick a million out there. I know one of my first sites was like a toy sort of index review site, and it had nothing to do with the word toys in it. It just had a whimsical name, right? Because that's sort of what I felt like doing. It doesn't mean that that's a bad thing. It just means that when you're creating your content, you're going to have to be very clear in your content you're creating. You're going to have to be very clear in your messaging for the users when they do get there about what it's about. So is it important? Yes. And there's a lot of weight given to URLs. Don't get me wrong, from search engines. There is a lot of weight, but it also depends on what is in the full URL of the article itself, not necessarily what the root domain always is. So there's, I would say, I wouldn't say it's a hard, fast rule. Stick to, you got to have millennials in there. You got to have trends, I mean, will it help? Yeah. But does it need to be that way? I don't know. If it's something that's, what is Etsy? What does that even mean? Right. It's like they were like, oh, let's find a URL. It's 5 letters and register it. You get my point. Like, I don't think it necessarily needs to be, I don't think, because what's going to happen is your URL structure is going to also include your content. And we'll talk a little bit more about that when we get into the CMS aspect. But I think the first thing is, and find something that's fitting, find something that's you, especially if it's like a personal blog. If you feel like you want to call it, sunrise, sunset, purple lion, that's cool. I mean, that's, if that's your vibe, go for it, especially if it's a blog, right? Because it's really about you as a person and the way you see the world. So, I mean, there are plenty of sites out there that you could name where you'd be like, yeah, what is that? That has nothing to do with what this is. So I think it's okay. So that's the first thing. Pick the URL. And here's the thing. There are plenty of free keyword research tools out there. And actually, when you're registering your URL, actually, most of them actually have recommendation tools on there. So they have some sort of keyword recommendation pieces.
I'm actually going to pull it up right now for us.
Yeah. So they actually have some keyword recommendation pieces that work. So if you put in Sunrise Millennial and someone owned that.com, it will give you recommendations around the word millennial, maybe around the word sunrise. So it will give you recommendations. So I think that's one thing to do. So sunrise, millennial.
Sunrise peaches.
Sunrise peaches.
Seems like something.
So what we'll do is Nicholas search. Very exciting, very exciting, very exciting. About to start her new blog. And sunrisepeaches.com with a hyphen in there is available. The Sunrise Peaches is available. So obviously someone has Sunrise Peaches, right?
Wait, no. Here it is. Sunrisepeaches.com is available.
Is available. There you go.
There you go. Sunrise Peaches.
Sunrise Peaches sounds like a peach farm somewhere in. But yes. So my point is, pick something that's like used. Like pick something like it's just something where it's very common.
But here are the recommendations you were talking about too.
Yeah. Oh, okay. It is doing the recommendations. So it's going to give you all the recommendations.
Funkypeaches.com.
Funky Peaches. There you go. So you can buy Funky Peaches for $2,000. Now, is Sunrise Peaches and Funky Peaches gonna change. I don't know. It's not going to make a difference in what you're doing, right? I wouldn't spend my $2,000 on that. But what happens is it will show you recommendations, not just the extension like the .com or the .this or .that. It will show you other versions. Now, here's the thing. It used to be a big practice to register like every type of version of your site that was there. So you'd have like sunrisepeaches.com, sunrisepeaches.net, and you would register all those. I don't necessarily think that's, if you're not a big company, I don't necessarily think that's a big deal for you to do. I wouldn't worry about registering all the .nets, the .orgs, there are so many whatevers out there. You'd probably spend a small fortune just, getting all those URLs for your blog. But the first thing is to pick it. And if the tool, like if you're registering at GoDaddy and you're not getting good recommendations, there are plenty of things out there that give you recommendations. So basically, you could use any of those recommendation keyword tools that are free, SEMrush, Moz. There are plenty of them out there that actually do some free keyword recommendations that you could look at. Now, the next thing is once you do that, you're basically going to have to choose a hosting plan. Now, what you really want to do is, as we see here with GoDaddy, they have GoDaddy hosting with WordPress. You're going to need a CMS, okay? WordPress is probably the most common CMS for blogs or even for sites. It's probably the most widely used. There are really cool parts about it. Some people don't necessarily like WordPress. There's a lot of things out there to build the site. I think GoDaddy even has another one outside of WordPress, their own, that you could use. Right. But WordPress is pretty simple and pretty cool, especially if the install is being done by GoDaddy, right? They're doing the install. It's not a self-install. Now what happens, the reason why WordPress is pretty cool is there's a whole bunch of themes and plugins so you can customize your site really easily, right? Really easily using WordPress with your different templates, and you could add in forms and add in all these different types of cool, tools. But here's the thing. Now, depending on what your sister wanted to do with this blog, like for instance, if her idea was to sell stuff to millennials, like so she was making some cool, I don't know, millennial hat that you could, sell on Etsy, right? And she wanted to sell it through her website. I would say, I don't know, GoDaddy does have components to sell stuff. WordPress does too. But I would say you may want to actually think about something like Shopify and go the opposite direction, where you'd go, and you could still register your domain through GoDaddy, but you're using the CMS of Shopify, where it's really geared towards selling. And now why I would say that is because you could still create your blog entries in Shopify. And I think each of them sort of has like their pros and cons, because Shopify, the blog stuff isn't really good. And what happens in WordPress, the selling experience isn't really good.
I've seen the GoDaddy CMS in terms of as an e-commerce platform on the back end. I was actually working with my hairdresser. She just launched a new product line and she was really excited, all natural skincare. So I kind of poked around in there, made sure she was doing everything correctly, and she chose to go with GoDaddy. Mm-hmm. And I think I've only used the GoDaddy CMS version once other than that. But I was in there and it was pretty, it was easy to use. It was easy to kind of connect the payment, she said. It was a really easy thing. But I think when you talk about Shopify versus something like WordPress or even GoDaddy, I guess your main question should be, what is first then second in terms of my priorities? Like, is it selling things, or is it writing shit and then maybe selling things later, or it's an afterthought? What's the main component?
Yeah, and I think and that may be something that evolves. You may start like, I'm just starting out as a blog, but now I'm getting traffic and I want to sell t-shirts, right? And or hats or whatever, right? So you may evolve that into a thing. The thing you really want to think about is how consistent is that? How consistent is that experience for the user? Like, they don't feel like they're going to a different site to go process the order. They want to feel like, for instance, with WordPress, most people use WooCommerce because it connects the easiest. It's not the greatest thing in the world, and some of the payment stuff is a little more wonky, whereas in if you're using Shopify, pretty much people can pay any way they want, right? So I think there's pros and cons of both, but I think you could evolve. It's not like you're going to go to the CMS. Most CMSs offer some sort of export that if you evolve in the future, you're able to go and evolve with your site, however it happens.
Now, let's say she gets to the point, she registers the domain, she decides she's going to stick with GoDaddy. That's pretty easy because they walk you through that, like go with GoDaddy. Now, what if she decides to go with WordPress? Now, does she have to pay money? Would be her next.
Well, I'm not sure with GoDaddy. I think they do offer.
Not with GoDaddy, with WordPress would be her next question.
Well, WordPress, you don't have to pay WordPress anything. WordPress is free. But GoDaddy, what you're doing is now they're installing your CMS of WordPress, your instance of WordPress, onto your domain. And I think you do need to pay GoDaddy as part of that hosting, right? Because your domain registration, so you pay yearly or every 2 years to renew your domain, right? Mm-hmm. Whereas your WordPress is actually hosting. So what's going to happen is you actually have to pick a hosting plan. So once you register your URL, the next thing is really deciding what you do need to decide what you want to do. Because to some degree, as we see here, you have web hosting, you have business hosting, you have reseller hosting. So depending on what you want to do, you want to make sure you have the tools for it. So, basically what we're looking at here is you would have to.
And there are different plans.
And here are the different plans. And you would have to make sure that $5.99 plan hosted WordPress, right? Or it had a piece where you could do online selling. So, and we see here, if you just stop for a second, Nicolette, you'll see here, you may decide you're going to do more than one website, right? The $5.99 is one website and 100 gigs worth of storage, but look at the $7.99, right? If you're going to have a lot of images or even downloads or whatever the case is, you may actually want to have unlimited storage. So you got to think a little bit about what you're going to do, but you don't have to fully plan it out for the rest of your life because you could always upgrade these things. Almost all these hosts, you could upgrade pretty easily. So really you want to look at what's the best thing for you when you're starting and making sure you can upgrade to go. You don't have to go with the highest plan from day one. You could start with a lower plan as long as it gives you, like for instance here, they all give you that one-click WordPress install, which means you're going, hey, install WordPress to this domain, and it does it for you. Now, I think the other thing when you talk to people about WordPress is maintaining it. The domain, they still, even though they're doing the WordPress install, it's still up to the individual users to update their plugins, update their themes. And I'm not sure about updating WordPress because some of these, right, some of them, they run a version of WordPress for everyone, and it's the same version of WordPress. Now, there are pros and cons of that too. They know it's in their control, but say for instance, there's a theme you want to do and it's not compatible with an older version of WordPress if GoDaddy hasn't updated WordPress across the board. So there are pros and cons when you do that versus even installing your own instance of WordPress on your site. So it just really depends on what your goals are. But, first, domain. Second, you have to decide what CMS you want to use because that's going to dictate what hosting plan you purchase from the provider.
Mm-hmm. These are your hosting plans, for example, on GoDaddy.
On GoDaddy, yeah. And look, they are saying the $12.99 one is the recommended one for WordPress. But what's interesting, if you scroll down, and I'm sure there are some details, there's really not much of a difference, in there. The only thing I can think of is the processing power, because WordPress can get pretty bloated, in terms of the amount of caching that happens. But there's also tools you can install in WordPress to help with the caching. So there's a lot of things that you could do. So
now, all right. So now she's going to set up. She decides she's going to go with. WordPress. Mm-hmm. Let's say she wants to be daring. What is the next thing that she needs to think about?
The next thing she needs to think about is how she's going to fill that site up, right? So once it's installed and she does that one-click install, right? And most hosting plans offer this sort of one-step install of things like WordPress and other tools. Once she does that, what happens is she really needs to think about, like, how am I structuring the content? Meaning, like, what does my site look like?
So you got to pick a theme, and that's a really cool thing about WordPress is that there are a lot of themes to choose.
Right. You got to decide what's going to be in your menu. You got to decide what pages you're going to create versus posts, which I think is a totally different conversation, right? Because that's actually starting to use WordPress. But I think you need to decide really the next thing is what the content and what the site is going to look like. But I think those are two sort of individual pieces, if that makes sense.
So you're pretty much ready to go.
You're pretty much ready to go.
Your website, sunriseunicorns.com.
Right, exactly. Sunrise peaches and unicorns, you know. So they only sell unicorns that are peach colored in some form. So yeah, and what we could do, and I think, you know, because this really leads into it, maybe, you know, I think we'll add a video that actually talks about how to set up WordPress, you know, and what should be created in pages and what should be created in posts and how you use all the different components of WordPress.
You know what? Maybe we'll even ask my sister if she wants us to use her site as an example. And we'll walk through that whole process of setting it up when she registers that domain and decides on a place. If she goes with WordPress, right? You never know. I still tell her to go with GoDaddy for this because I don't think I think you really need to look at your, like we said in the beginning, what is your purpose, right? I think
what's your skill set, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Do you really want to spend some time? Do you even care what the site really, you know, she wants to look trendy, right? Trendy is her thing. Trendy. It's got to look trendy. So, I mean, you could pretty much do that anywhere. I think that's the only
it really, honestly, it's select. That's when you get into your build out, right? So, and I think your build out is much different than your, and even in themes, look, you know, I know you and I have had multiple discussions on themes, like what you need to look for in themes, even though they look cool, it may not be the right thing for you.
Yeah, we'll talk about that in another video. I think that's important.
Absolutely.
All right, so that's it. We walked through how to set up a website for super beginners. And if you have any questions, feel free to reach out. If you'd like to see a video on something else website related, we'd be happy to walk you through it. And don't forget to subscribe.
And leave comments below if you want us to talk about anything. If you have particular questions